All right. Well, thank you, Asif. I appreciate the intro. And like he was saying, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I did a session building a better intranet, which is another session that we often do. But this is really drilling down on just the adoption piece. And to be honest, many of you on here may have a little bit of we saw the numbers drop off with this webinar, but may have a little bit of adoption webinar fatigue, right? There's been a lot of talk about adoption, but we do this day in and day out. I won't steal any of my thunder, but this is really these really are the five core reasons why we see SharePoint adoption failing, and not just immediate, while you're deploying it or immediately after you deploy it, but long term. Why do people start using it and then fizzle out? So it's going to be a great session. But before I jump in, I always like to ask this question, and really I think it's great for you all to ask this question of yourselves. I mean, why are you here? Why did you sign up for this? Was it because your boss forwarded it to you? Are you really multitasking right now and doing other things? Are you starting a new project, maybe a migration, and want a few tips on adoption? Or, are you here because despite your best efforts, you still have low engagement, low adoption, and really want to know how to improve that and do better? So it's I always believe why is a very powerful word, and I'll talk more about why a little bit later on, because that's one of the keys to adoption is this word why. But I would just ask you to take a few seconds and maybe jot it down, or just think about what do you want to get out of this. And if you feel so inclined, you can certainly ask in the question panel there. I'll try to. I'm probably not going to answer the questions as we go through, but I will definitely queue those up, and we'll have time at the end to go through and ask them the questions for everyone. So I can't promise I'm going to hit everything, but what I do promise is if you ask something, I'll follow up directly with you, every single person, tips, advice, whatever I can do. So the other question I would ask on top of, why are you here? Why is adoption important to you is what is user adoption? I mean, I think a lot of times we skip over that part and we run full steam into here's all the things you can do to drive adoption without really understanding, well, adoption means different things to different organizations, right? I mean, it's not a one size fits all. There are some core things we can all do, but what you got to understand is what really, is adoption. What does an adoption success look like to you? Is it more users using it? Maybe you have 5% using it now, you want 50%. Is it that no one's complaining about it? Is it increased productivity, fewer emails? I mean, what does SharePoint adoption look like? So that's really important to be able to apply all these things that we're going to talk about is really understanding how are we going to measure it? What does it even mean? And what are the boxes that we check to say, yes, we've achieved SharePoint adoption? That's going to be really, really important. So before we dive into the meat of the five steps, I want to share a little bit of bad news first. And some of you that have seen me speak may have seen this stat already. But the bad news is there's a lot of struggles going on in SharePoint, right? The latest stat as of last year was about 63% of all SharePoint projects either struggle, stall, or flat out fail. So there's a ton of people struggling with SharePoint, and a lot of these have to do with adoption. In fact, about one in every three organizations actually struggles with adoption right now. So more than about 30% of all organizations say that yes, adoption is a big deal. This is actually going up as well. Both those numbers, what is interesting, if you look at trends, those are both going up. So even though technology is getting better and it's supposed to make us easier and be more intuitive and work the way we work, we're struggling more and we've got lower adoption. So what gives, right? What's the disconnect? Why do we have such a struggle? And that's really what I want to talk about today and kind of focus on in the next hour or so. So real quick about me, and then we'll jump into the content. Like I said, my name is Curtis Hughes, one of the managing partners and co-founders of C5 Insight. My contact info is there on the screen. Would love for you to tweet and be socially engaged if you're so inclined throughout the session. And you can see my focus there. I won't go into a ton, be happy to spend more time, but we focus a lot as an organization on digital workplace. We do SharePoint, Dynamic CRM, 365, a lot of those things, but I spend most of my time specifically around not the implementation of the tools, though we do a lot of that and we have teams that do that. I spend my time with clients on, okay, great, you implemented it. Is it adding value? How do we make sure it adds value? How do we make sure people actually use it and that it's actually doing the things you need it to do to drive business value? That's where I spend a lot of my time working closely with executives and teams on making sure that it sticks. So just to make sure that no one on here thinks that I've made these steps up, I want to talk just for a minute before we jump in on where this came from. So you guys can read that on the screen, but the short of it is a few years ago we started to realize that a lot of organizations coming to us weren't ones saying, hey, we got SharePoint and we haven't installed it yet. We want tips on how to do this. It was really a lot of people coming to us saying, hey, we've implemented this ourselves, or maybe we used another partner, whatever it was, and we're just struggling. Maybe people aren't using it. Maybe it's search. Maybe something's broken. Broken. Just a lot of issues. And so we realized that, hey, there's a lot of organizations struggling with this. I wonder how many of our new proposals really are that. And so we did some quick analysis. We use CRM, so it was pretty easy to get, and found out that almost 60% of all of our business and proposals going out the door were for what we called rescue projects, turnaround projects, people that already had SharePoint, intranets, and these tools, and they were struggling with them. They needed them to be rescued, and so maybe they had a black eye in the organization. People weren't using them anymore, whatever the case was. So out of this great data set of 60% struggle and 60% failure, we came up with a lot of things. One of my sessions, 7 deadly sins, this session came out of that. So a lot of good data on, okay, if we can focus on the failures, then that'll tell us what people are doing wrong and how do we avoid that. So that's really where this came from. So let's jump in and start talking through the core 5 reasons that we see SharePoint projects fail today. So item number 1 is really around, let's see if I can get this slide to advance. Here we go. Step number 1 is really around having a formal plan. And you'd think, honestly, when I say this, people are like, well, yeah, duh, we've got to have a formal plan, right? We've got to have some sort of plan for people to actually use and do that. But you'd be pretty amazed at how many people don't have a formal plan. So I'd ask the question to you on the session right now: how many of you in your organization, I don't know where everyone is with their SharePoint deployment, whether they're just starting or what they're doing, but do you have a formal plan, not for SharePoint, but for specifically how do we get people to use this? Short term, long term, how do we make sure people use it? How do we give them the tools they need to use it? And the truth is, many of you probably don't. In fact, only 1 in 6 organizations actually admits to having a formal SharePoint adoption plan. 1 in 6. And so that's a very, very small percentage, right? And that means that only 1 in 6 organizations has any sort of checklist, roadmap, or plan for how they're going to get people to actually use the platform. And so they're expecting to just deploy SharePoint, and it's got these great things that, yeah, the users have asked for, right? The users have asked for team sites and intranet and all these other things. That doesn't necessarily mean they're gonna use it, right? How do we actually get them to use that and to make it sticky? And it's not automatic, and that's one thing we're seeing. And a lot of people think that adoption is often automatic. It's not automatic. It doesn't just happen by just putting it in place. And one of the ways that we can try to improve this statistic, and one of the ways and things we put in place is really around this idea of a steering committee, some sort of leadership team and steering committee that actually helps put together these policies, these adoption plans, and not only that, because anyone can build one, but how do we make sure it's being implemented and the governance around that and being used, right? And that people getting their questions answered. And that's one thing we see, that people kind of start SharePoint, they may have a project steering committee, right? That is in place during the project, but what happens after the project's finished? And that's where we see the fizzle kind of start taking place, right? And people are using it really strong, and then once people stop meeting, once there's a driver and someone kind of checking in and making sure that it's still meeting the needs and that people still have what they need to get work done, it starts to fizzle out. And we see that time and time and time again. It's funny how we see this immediate bump, especially when you go to a new technology like a 365 and you're using all this greatest tools like Planner and Groups and all these new things they have. It's kind of like when you eat a piece of candy and there's a lot of sugar, right? You get this immediate jolt of energy, and then it starts to fade out. And that's what all this great new and shiny technology does. But you've got to have some way to sustain that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And the steering committee can. So ask yourselves, how many of you have a have a project or a long-term SharePoint steering committee in place that is still meeting even after the project's rolled out. And we see teams meet anywhere from every 6 months to every quarter. We had in one of my sessions last week, I had a guy tell me they're still meeting daily, which is crazy. That's a lot, but weekly. But we think every 6 months, every quarter is plenty once it's out there. But a lot of our clients still meet every month as well. So making sure you still have a driver and still have some process for checking in on that. And I talked about why, right? And the key question of why you're here. But the other question is, why are we doing SharePoint? Why are we implementing X, Y, or Z? And one thing I can tell you that happens time and time again is that if you can't define your why, if you can't define why you're doing something specifically and concisely and be able to write it down, this is why we did this, then users will never find their way and they'll always be lost, right? I mean, they need someone to guide them and help them understand why they're doing this, why they're having to change. I mean, this is what adoption is about, right? It's about change. So why am I doing it, going from using an Excel sheet to now having to do a SharePoint list or upload this and do it a totally different way? Why is that important? And a lot of organizations don't connect those dots for their users. They just put it out there, they train them, and I'll share this in a minute. They'll train them, but training alone is not enough. You've really got to help users understand what's in it for them. That's what they care about. It's not being selfish, but all of us have tasks that we have to do, right? We're graded on our performance. So we have to get things done. So why do I need to do this? And if it's going to slow me down, what am I going to get on the other side? And am I ever going to speed up again? So helping users really understand why you're doing it. And again, if you can't answer that question, then you need to go back and figure out why are we actually doing this SharePoint project. One tool that we've actually built, which is pretty interesting, and I'll show you where you can get this. I'll give this to you guys and be able to download it later on. But it's a quick little, I call it the 60-second success assessment, basically. And really what it does is it asks a few key questions, 8 questions to be exact, and really helps you figure out how likely you are for SharePoint success. And what's interesting about this is that if you look at the questions, none of them are specific about the technology and what technology you're implementing. If you look at how they're all worded and done, they're really around culture. So if we were to play out how this looks, basically the way it works is that you answer the questions on the left, right? So let's say I answer these 2 questions. Our best work is produced by individuals, and for someone to succeed, someone won't succeed. And then we answer the same thing on the questions on the bottom. All right, answer as many of those. We work regularly. And then you find the number. So I answered 2 on the left and 1 in the middle. You draw a line between those 2 numbers, and that'll tell you your likelihood of success with SharePoint. It's not super scientific, but we found it to be very, very accurate as a quick high-level assessment of, hey, we've got some issues. We've got some things we need to fix because people are not going to adopt this. People don't want to use it. SharePoint doesn't mix with our culture right now. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't think about. They think that SharePoint can just be shoehorned into any culture. And there's a lot of cultures out there that we actually see where SharePoint, they're just not ready for a tool like SharePoint or the collaboration that comes along with it. I wish it were different. I wish SharePoint was a great fit for every organization, but you've got to be ready as well. So I'll show you if you want to download a PDF version of this and can do different scenarios. I'll show you where you can do that at the end as well. So you've got to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row and that your organization is really ready and that you've got a plan for how are we actually going to do this. So this is another one of those that a lot of people say is obvious or should be obvious. But again, I wouldn't put it in this deck as one of 5 steps, right? If it weren't important. And I know this is a big bucket, right? Put people first. Well, that's huge. What does that mean? That's very vague. But that's why you're here, right? To get people to use this better. But somewhere along the way, and I say this all the time, somewhere along the way with these tools, we lost sight of why we're doing them, I think, and I love collaboration tools, but I think somewhere along the way we kind of became, enamored with and had this love affair with technology and all this great new shiny technology. And then we forgot to really keep our people at the center of everything we're doing. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? That's who's using it. And so one of the things you guys have to realize is that implementing SharePoint and building an awesome intranet that is super branded and has all these great bells and whistles and is integrated and all these things is awesome. But if no one uses it, or they don't want to use it, or they go around it and do something else, it's pointless. It has no value whatsoever, and the return on investment for that is zero, right? I mean, if no one's using it, then your tool is worthless. So the key is not only just building it, but making sure we're building it specific to how people need to use it. And to do that, you've got to put people first. You've got to start with people and put them really literally at the center of everything you're doing. And so when I ask a lot of audiences, how well do you know your users? And most of them are like, yeah, we know our users pretty well. I know exactly what they need. And then I start asking a few more probing questions like, how many of you can tell me the percentage of millennials in your organization? And then they kind of look at me with a blank stare and they say, okay, maybe that wasn't fair. How many of your users, what percentage use their mobile device to check email or the intranet versus sitting at a desktop? Well, more blank stares. And so there's hundreds of these kind of questions that I think we look at the surface, but if we were to just get a little bit deeper, understanding really how our users work, what frustrates them, how do they actually work day to day? I give you a good example. I read a study in the last couple weeks that actually came out and said that on average, an employee, when they're in the office, actually in the office, is only at their desk 50 to 60% of the time. So that's pretty amazing to me, but we don't think like that. We think that if they're in the office, they're sitting at their desktop, but we're running around from meeting to meeting, looking at our phone, trying to get things in the car, whatever it may be, right? And so we've got to understand how our people are working, and not every group's going to work that way. Engineering and the guys at the plant, they're there probably, right? But maybe your executives or whoever it is, they're out somewhere else. You've got to understand who is our audience and how are we going to do these things. So making sure we put people first, we're delivering immediate value. That's one of the big things that drives adoption, making sure we give them something. A lot of people call it kind of the low-hanging fruit. But again, making it easy, reducing friction. I'll talk about that later on. So part of what we have to spend a lot of time doing as an organization, and what you guys will have to do if you're part of the steering team or the leadership team to try to drive SharePoint and the success of SharePoint, is to actually start shifting your thinking away from what technology, and is that groups versus planner versus Yammer versus this or that, right? I mean, a lot of times we're focusing on what technologies we need to implement, and is that a web part, or is that a workflow, or is that Nintex? I mean, all these things we can throw out. We need to better understand our users, how they're working, who they work with, what their needs really are. And there's a great Gartner study out there that talks all about putting technology at the center and how that leads to success. They actually have it as high as 80% failure rate if you start and lead with technology. So I'll show you what we actually found from some of this. So what we actually found was that conventional wisdom kind of flows like this. So I break things up into this triangle of people, process, and technology, right? That's about how we spend our time on these different projects at a high level, right? And conventional wisdom, and typically what we saw in general, was about 25% on people. Yeah, we got to gather some requirements, and we know we got to do some of those things. About 25% on the process and managing the process, and we know we have to do a project plan. And then about 50% on what are we building, how are we building it, the configuration, going back and forth with developers, is that custom, all these pieces, right? But this was the mixture, if you will, of the 60% that were coming to us struggling. So we said, well, maybe this isn't working so well. What should we do differently? So this is actually where we came up with what we're now calling the 40-20-40 principle. And you guys may have seen something similar. This is the mixture we use. And so today we actually run our projects, for the most part, about 40% of the time we spend on people, about 40% on the process, and about 20% on the actual technology and implementation. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I could probably spend an hour alone just on this makeup and how we do this and why we do it. But think of it like building a house, right? And before you can build a house, there's a lot of work that goes into, one, just architecting, right? Building out the blueprint, the architect building it out. I mean, that takes months probably to engineer it. And then you got to figure out where you're building it. Will the lot be the right lot? All these kind of things, right? And then someone takes these blueprints, goes out with a team, and builds it in a couple weeks. I mean, they build a house really that quick once they have the groundwork. And that's the same thing here. Honestly, the technology is some of the easier parts. I mean, Microsoft's given us a lot of great tools, but a lot of the legwork needs to go 70 to 80% in the people and the process. How are we going to manage it? The governance around that? How are we going to get people to adopt it? Are we really focusing on them? And what I always like to tell people with this is that this isn't 120 or 150%. The ratio and the makeup of this is still 100%. We're just shifting how we're actually spending our time. And one nice kind of bonus from this is that our projects have actually finished under budget more often and faster because we're not having to rework and go back and people don't like it and we have better adoption. I mean, the list goes on and on and on because we're spending more time up front. So instead of a month spending time with people and then, 6 months building it, we spend 3, 4, 5 months with people and the process and making sure we have all that in a row, and then we go build it in a month or two. And maybe sometimes it takes longer to build it, but I can guarantee you have less going back, fixing, less trying to fix, bad impressions and things that didn't work for the first time and that didn't work like people work whenever you have this different mixture. So hopefully this is one thing you guys can take away. I know it won't be perfect. Not everyone's going to be in this 80-20 mixture. But just use this as kind of a checklist. Are we spending 70 to 80% of our time on people and process, and about 20 to 30 on technology, or is it the other way around? And that'll tell you kind of, hey, we might need to adjust that. And so I love this kind of thing that I came up with, and it really is the heart of this entire thing. If it's user-centered, and if you put users at the center of this, it'll always be user-supported. There's no reason why people won't use it, and many of the reasons why they don't is because it really wasn't focused around knowing how they really work. IT or whoever led this said that, oh yeah, we know exactly what we need to do, and the user said, that's not how I work. If they would have sat with me for a day and just shadowed me or looked over my shoulder, they would have realized I don't work like that at all. That's maybe 1% of the time, and 99% of the time I work totally differently. Understanding those things, and I guarantee it'll always be user supported. And I see some questions, so feel free to ask those, and I'll answer those at the end if they're questions or if they're technical things. Reach out on those as well. So this is one thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. And if you guys want this, I'll actually give you a download where you can go download this. This is, and some of you may have seen this. This is a feedback solution that we actually built that works across on premises or online. And it helps with putting people first, and it gives users a way to provide feedback. And I know there's a lot of different things out there where tools, but we found this to just hit home. It's really easy, really quick, and again, gives your users a way when they're anywhere in SharePoint browsing around. There's a quick little link up at the top. They click feedback, it pops a dialog box. They can put in their feedback, it tracks the page they're on, and it sends it to a SharePoint list. Nothing super fancy about it, very simple, but then you can put alerts, permissions, workflows, whatever you need on this feedback list. But it's amazing because before this, most people, when I asked them about how they collect feedback and how they ask their users, well, we just ask them to email us if they've got any ideas or if something's not working, or enter a help desk ticket or whatever it is. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in SharePoint or I'm working, I'm there to do something specific, and so are your users, right? So I'm not going to take time to go over to my email, open up Outlook, let me tell them about this great idea I had. I'm just going to forget about it and like, yeah, it's not worth it. I'm just going to go on. Most of the time, that's what happens. So unless it's a huge deal that's kind of causing them not to be able to do work. So this allows users to be able to give you feedback and puts them at the center and gives them a vested interest in what they're doing. And within 2 or 3 seconds, you can capture feedback. And it's been amazing to see the feedback that's been captured. And then the steering committee or whoever your team is can look at this feedback and say, wow, we've got some trends here. Maybe we need to readjust the content on this page because it's not really working the way we need it to work. So some really great things there. All right, step number 3. Once we've got those things in place, this was honestly, and consultants can still have these aha moments. This was an aha moment for me in the last few years, and I think it's a missing link today, and it's a biggie. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on this and just kind of talk through what this is. I like to think of SharePoint, and especially if you're using SharePoint as an intranet or those kind of tools, it's a bridge, right? It's a bridge between the organization and its people, right? Connecting people to each other, connecting people to things within the organization. And so there's a lot of ways that we can think of SharePoint as this nice bridge inside of the organization. And the more bridges you can build inside your organization, the more engagement and adoption that you'll have. But bridges can often be scary, right? They can be scary to cross sometimes. Sometimes they're not built very well. And so I want to talk for just a minute about the wrong way, and how not to approach SharePoint and kind of building this bridge. So I'm going to bring up on the screen, you'll see a kind of a chart coming up here that talks about really what we're trying to accomplish, right? So in general, on the left side there, you've got productivity, and you could put anything you want here. You could put, we want greater innovation, productivity, efficiency, whatever it is. And most of our organizations are doing okay, right? We're not at the very bottom. We're not, some of these things we're doing better than others. But if we use productivity, we're not bad. We know what we're doing. We've been doing it for a long time, and we're pretty good at it, but we want to be better. That's why we're doing something. We want to be better. We're just not doing it as effectively as we think we can. So most people think that going from where you are today to where you want to be tomorrow is kind of this straight line, right? And over time, that's how we get there. We just put some things in place and then we get there. Now, if you're really, more realistic about it, and you say, no, that's not really how it works. Maybe it works something more like this. And we know there's some ups and downs, and there's going to be some struggles, and then there's going to be some high, points. This is really what it looks like. But what I want to tell you is that both of these are wrong. And this is kind of the aha moment of how does this curve really look? How does this actually work when we roll out new things like SharePoint? When we roll out a new tool or deploy new functionality in SharePoint, what does this curve actually look like over time in our productivity? And what we found is that this is actually what it looks like. The curve looks something more like this. And so let me explain this. So how many of you like to do things, slower, make mistakes, be unproductive for a while, right? Nobody likes to do that. But what we found is that between where you are today and where you are tomorrow and where you want to be, what is between here and there, right? There's this big valley, there's this dip that we all have to go through. And in that are all kinds of things like slowing down, doing things a different way, making some mistakes because, oops, I pushed the wrong button and that didn't work right, or that workflow didn't do the way I wanted it to. There's all kinds of things in there. And a lot of people don't think about this. And we honestly didn't think this way. But after seeing it for so many years, this is really what happens to your users and their productivity and everything over time before they get to where you want them to go. It's never a straight line. It's not even a curvy line. It's going to go through this big dip. And so what happens to users is they know this, right? And they're smart and they know that, hey, I'm doing it this way and you're telling me to do it that way. That seems like a lot more work. Or I've got to upload this now through this interface and do these things. I'm just going to keep doing it the way I'm doing it. And so they put on the brakes and they say, whoa, I'm not going to do that. And so they don't go down this hill because they know that's what's coming. Because in the end, all of us at our jobs are measured and rated, if you will, on our performance, right? On being more productive, on not slowing down. We've all got our day jobs, right? We've all got so many things going on. Last thing we want is to slow down. And so the last thing they want to do is go through this slowdown period. So you know what? I'm just going to keep doing it. I'm not going to adopt it. I'm going to keep doing it the way I did it. Or I'm just going to go over here and go around your system and maybe do Dropbox. That's so much easier than what you've got here with this OneDrive thing. I'm going to do it the other way. And so we've got to help manage expectations. And really what we've actually found is that it goes beyond the users. It's actually at the manager level a lot of times, because helping managers and helping leadership understand that, hey, your users are going to slow down before they speed up. We need to give them permission, if you will, to make some mistakes. And so some of the things, just a really quick idea, and we've got tons of these that we did, was a lot of organizations, let's say we're doing an intranet on SharePoint, we have an intranet play day, if you will, where all it is, no meetings, it's Friday, maybe it's just a half a day. We rolled this out, or maybe it's in a pilot. Today, all you have to do, and you can just play on the internet all day long, make mistakes, try some new workflows, figure out what you're doing, and you'd be amazed at what it does to help people's confidence and to help people figure out, oh, okay, yeah, it is a little bit more cumbersome to do it that way, but look what I get. Man, I can get all this reporting. And so connecting those dots and giving people permission to slow down before they speed up. It's pretty amazing. So what you guys have to do is you have to focus on building this bridge. And there's a lot of different things that go into building this bridge. There's a lot of things right here where you need to focus. And that could be, like I said, anything from giving them permissions or giving them permission to play on the internet, making sure that their managers know. But even beyond building the bridge to make it easy to get from point A to point B, you've got to help them cross that bridge. You've got to, again, tell them why. Why do we want to change? Why are we changing? And help them cross that bridge from one side to the other. So there's a big dip. Everybody knows we've got to go through it. How do we make sure that we don't go through that? And so let me give you guys a couple more practical tips. And I love this quote. And again, adoption and SharePoint, this is really what's at the core of it. It's really at its core about change. And I know, this is a little bit fluffy and higher level, but really the people that are initiating the change, and those of you on this that are in charge of leading the effort for SharePoint, change is happening, whether you want it to or not. And so if you're doing something new, it's going to have change and it's going to have an impact. So are you going to kind of be the ones that initiate and have your hands on the reins of that change, or are you just going to let it kind of happen? And the other thing I would say is that keep in mind, All of us think that are, all of us are going to change, and all these organizations, we want this great change and we want to be more productive. Organizations don't change. They never do. Change always starts at the individual level. And this was another kind of one of those ahas that we all want change. We want to do more productive across our department. It starts with the single individual. It starts with Mary and Bob and all the individuals that are using this tool, getting them to change and adopt and understand that, wow, this is really great. And then they tell other people and building these champions. So organizations never change on their own. It starts at the individual level. So you've really got to put that personal touch and making sure through communication plans, through all kinds of things, that you've communicated why we're doing this and that you've really helped people cross that bridge. Like I said, we've got a ton of these ideas on how do we actually do that through communication plans and training plans and lunch and learns and webinars and all kinds of things within the organization. So be the one that embraces the change, and again, focus on that individual personalization. Another way that we can help build these bridges is really, with integration. I don't know about you, but I don't just work with one application per day or per week. I mean, we all work with so many applications. In fact, ZDNet said that the average employee works with about 25 different applications per week. And so the last thing you want is for SharePoint to be just another application, another silo of information that I've got to go to, and now I've got to go over to my CRM, and now I've got to go over here to my ERP and all those kind of things, right? How do we think about SharePoint as a hub, and how do we bring information into it, maybe push information out that helps people do their jobs? Again, that's where sitting with them and really knowing them really helps to help understand how does information flow in and out of these organizations and these departments and this user. How do they use information? What are some key areas, maybe the top 3 integration points that we could implement in phase 1 that would give someone a lot of bang for their buck and help them add a lot of value and build a bridge between different things that they have to do and not make it so hard on them. And then the last thing is, making sure that when you're working on SharePoint and you get the team together, at the end of the day, you don't have to build this yourself, and you really shouldn't build it yourself. It doesn't mean if you've got 200 people in your organization that you have a 200-person project team. But what it does mean is through the feedback, through surveys, through reaching out and communication, get people involved, because without a doubt, people will always support and jump on the bandwagon of things that they've helped create. And it's amazing what this has done for adoption. If IT or whatever group goes off in a silo, tries to gather some requirements, then comes back and rolls this thing out, and people don't adopt it and they wonder why, maybe it doesn't fit, but there's no vested interest. If you can really truly get people involved so that they've had input in this, maybe it's through a survey, like I said, or something else, psychologically, people have a vested interest in your SharePoint succeeding. They want it to succeed because they've actually helped build it in some small way. So make sure you get people involved. People are always going to support what they help create. Get them involved early on. So step 4, we got all those things done, and some orgs, and organizations do a great job of building bridges. Some of them build a plan. Some of them have all these great things. But unfortunately, we see a lot of people that maybe build these bridges that are curvy, that are kind of full of potholes, and they're really painful to cross. Maybe there's a bridge, but it's kind of painful. And so how many of your users, I would ask you this question, right? How many of your users feel like working in SharePoint involves kind of crossing an electric fence or barbed wire to get things done? How many really feel like there's roadblocks in place, right? And you may say, no, not us. Everyone can get access to it. Maybe, but is it easy for them to use, or do they have to jump through hoops? You see security and permissions and access and those kind of things is just one roadblock that we often see in SharePoint, just making it difficult. But there's a ton of other things that add all these barriers in place that make it hard. And I mean, that's the easiest way to say it, right? Is what you're doing making it hard? Is there some way I can eliminate that extra click or that extra, place that they have to go to see that? Can I surface some information? Remove all the roadblocks and make it as easy as possible, because we're very fragmented, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So I'd ask you a question, and I'd pose this to everyone here. When was the last time that you actually stopped and asked your users how SharePoint was working for them and what they would change? I mean, it's a fair question, right? When was the last time you sent out a survey? Maybe you just asked a single department that are heavy users. What don't you like about SharePoint? One of the things I love to do is the start, stop, continue, I'll call them. And so you send out a survey or something, maybe an email, and just say, hey, could you tell me 3 things SharePoint should start doing, 3 things it should stop doing, and 3 things it should continue to do? Really easy, doesn't ask for a whole lot of, commentary. Just give me 3 things: start, stop, continue. It's amazing what you'll get back, but a lot of organizations aren't doing that, right? They're not even asking, what can we do differently, right? How can we actually change how people are working for the better? And is it actually, what we delivered, is it actually helping them? Or have they done something different and they're working around those kind of things now, right? So there's a ton of these potential roadblocks. But what I want to share is just 3 of these that we see regularly and that are really hurting adoption. I'll just give you kind of the top 3, if you will, of these roadblocks. So the first one is around governance. And I know governance is a hot topic. A lot of people, it's kind of, that you're talking about governance and that it actually is a roadblock. We're huge fans of governance, huge proponents. We build governance plans. But without a doubt, the one thing that you've really got to make sure of is that your governance is balanced. And we've seen this shift, I think with so much, with the compliance and regulatory, that people are taking this very rigid approach to governance and applying it across their entire SharePoint implementation. And so I came up with kind of this rigid at the core, flexible at the edges model. And so if you think about this sphere, it's really SharePoint. Think of it like your SharePoint. And you've got your core. Every organization has their core, and that's your non-negotiables, things you just have to have in place. Maybe that's corporate metadata. Maybe that's retention and auditing policies. Maybe that's some sort of HIPAA or SOX or some sort of compliance. Maybe that's the content that gets published to your homepage that has to go through approval. Whatever that case may be, the things that, hey, this is the way it is, we've got to have these in place. That's your core. Everything else, to be honest, is pretty much your edges. When you look out at your collaboration, your team sites, maybe your OneDrive for Business, whatever you're using, and where departments kind of play in some of these other areas where project sites are happening, check in, check out, locations, keywords, personal views. I mean, we see some of these things so locked down that people can't work the way they actually need to work. And so what happens is they actually just find another way around it, right? Users are going to do what they need to do to get their work done. And so instead of using the secure system that you've put in place in SharePoint and this great platform where everybody can benefit from the content, they're going around and we see this all the time, and they're using an FTP site. Maybe they're doing Dropbox. Maybe they're emailing this thing around. I mean, you name it, the sky's the limit. People are going to do what they need to do. So why not give them a platform that actually works the way they work? And if you'll think about it, all this really goes back to knowing how the users work. What kind of teams are going to be collaborating on those sites? Where are they going to be located when they do the collaboration? Do they need external sharing? Is that okay to turn that on? What do they need? And so making sure really that we have a balanced view of governance. You've got to make sure you look at both sides of this. The next thing I want to talk about is this idea of ROT. And I don't know, how many of you have never heard this term ROT? And a lot of people really haven't heard this, ROT. And it stands for redundant, obsolete, or outdated and trivial. And I can guarantee many of you probably haven't heard of that term, but I can guarantee that your users and you probably have experienced it in your organization. And really what it has to do with is just all the outdated, the redundant, the trivial content that's getting in the way. And most often we see this redundant and outdated or obsolete content. We had a client that was doing searches, and some of the searches were bringing back results from 2004, and this was like a year or two ago. So 10-year-old, results that didn't even matter anymore. So why is that in there? How do we get a handle on that? And so this ROT, a lot of people think that by storing all this content and having all this extra data, it's really costing us in storage, and we've got to store all this data somewhere, or maybe it's online storage or whatever it is. But to be honest, that's actually the least of what it's actually costing, because at the end of the day, this is kind of how it plays out. There's a lot of ROT, and people go to find something in your SharePoint, let's say, right? And they spend a few minutes, and I don't know about you, but I don't have an hour to try to look for something. So a couple things happen. One, they persist and they keep on looking for it, and maybe it doesn't take an hour, maybe it takes a few minutes or a half hour or something like that, and they finally find it. And then once they find it, what they do is they say, well, you know what? I don't have to go through that again. I don't even know where that is. So maybe they bookmark it, or most often they'll download that, right? Or email it to themselves so they have it in their email, or download it locally, or store it somewhere else. So now you've got this copy that's no longer kept up to date, right? They just got this copy of it, and now they've got it offline, and they want to store that the way they want to store it, or share it the way they want to store it. And so that's one of the big issues is trying to find it. The other issue is that there was a study, I can't remember who did the study, but I actually read that 70% of users have said they've recreated something because they weren't able to find it fast enough. 70%. And so how many users in your organization, and think about across the world, how many people are recreating stuff and spending time recreating because they can't find it fast enough, because they can't get to it. And a lot of people are struggling with this search and with this kind of content management and this content struggle right now. And so I'd ask you, how much rot do you think you have in your SharePoint? How much of this old, outdated content, redundant, maybe it doesn't make sense, maybe it's confusing. How much is in there? What we've actually seen, and this is from AIIM, the average company considers about 58% of their content to be rot, almost 60%. So let's say you just have half of this. 29, 30% of your content is probably rot. I can almost guarantee that. So what are you doing about it? How are you handling that? And we've got a ton of ideas and things on that. If you want some more of those, reach out. We've got some templates of how to identify rot and some scripts and things like that. But you've got to identify, just remember, redundant, outdated, or trivial. How do I identify that content, figure out what buckets that's in, and then figure out what needs to happen with it? And not only the initial getting rid of the rot content, but how do I make sure I don't get rot in the future? What are the policies that say after a year this goes up for approval and we have to push it off somewhere? What happens then, right? What do I do? What do I do when that happens? The last one I want to talk about is really what I kind of call less is more, and I'll talk about it, and I talked about it a little bit in my Building a Better Intranet session, but this one is big for adoption, and I kind of call it the ABCs of less is more, something really easy to remember. So let's just go through these one by one. So the first thing is the attention span. Most users today, when they're using SharePoint, Intranet, these collaboration tools, 365, they have about a 2 to 3 second attention span. They want to be able to find where they need to go and what they're looking for, even if it's just the next link that they need to click on, within 2 to 3 seconds of scanning a page. We don't have time to just sit there and just kind of browse and click around and things like that. Some of you may, but most users do not. So we really got to think about, how do we surface the information quickly? Maybe it's the top left most thing that we put. How do we organize content on our pages? Where do we put it? How do we make sure it's clean and clear and really focused on what they're trying to get out of it? The B is for this bite-sized delivery, and I was just talking about this before the session began. And this is really how we deliver content. So the old way of thinking used to be, hey, we just put a bunch of content on a page, and we want to minimize clicks, right? We don't want people to have to click through. But today we're so fragmented and we're so bombarded with information overload that we really want things in really small pieces. If you think about how apps are designed and those kind of things, we want it clean, and we want to deliver things in this bite, snack, and meal format. The bite being just a little bit. Tell me exactly what I need to know. And then what's the snack? What's the next little piece that I can get? And honestly, some people might stop at the snack. They've got enough. They've got enough information, and that's all they needed. If you want more, you dig into the meal. You get the full wiki page on all this information, or the full document. Maybe I just wanted to stop at the snack, and that's who updated it last, or something like that. And I'll show you a couple of how this looks in just a minute. And then the last one is just being consistent. I mean, you'd be amazed at how many organizations have every single department page looks different. Things are in the left corner, the right corner, the bottom, the footer, all over the place, right? And so consistency is key. Familiarity breeds findability, right? If it's familiar, we'll be able to find it easy, and it's consistent. All of us want something consistent. The keys on our keyboard, where things are located, right? And we want it to be consistent. The same thing should be true within your sites. I know there's going to be some differences, but if you have a contact information, don't put it on the left or the bottom on one and the right and the top on another. Make sure everything you do is consistent throughout, and so it'll be in the same place. So let me show you a little bit about what this looks like. So two great examples I just like to show, and kind of extremes, if you will. So the one up on the top left, obviously our friend Google there, but a lot of you use this search engine, maybe you use Bing, but very similar. They know you're there to search, right? What are we there for? We're there to search. What's front and center? Search with a couple buttons on it, right? I mean, that's it. One box with a couple buttons. Now look around the page and you can get to everything else you need to get to. They've got things tucked away in the top right. You can get to all the other applications. You can get to your account settings. You can navigate anywhere you want to go. The bottom left, the bottom right, there's a few things. But front and center, they know you're there to search. So again, going back to the users, what they need on this department page or on this landing page, what are the users in that department or that are going to be using that page the most? What do they care about? What do they need? What content needs to be front and center? We've got to think about that. On the other side, we've got kind of the White House page, and this is a great example of a couple things here, and really around the bite snack meal. So if you look at their top navigation, I mean, in general, we recommend anywhere from 5 to 7 at the most, usually around 4 or 5 top level navigation. But the bite here is issues. That's the issues. All right, I know I want that. The snack is maybe it's economy. That's the economy. And I can see the top issues that are going on with the economy. If I click on economy, then I get everything going on and the specific item for one economic issue, right? Same thing for education or healthcare. And so delivering things in this really, how do I get there really fast? I mean, this would allow people to get there really, really fast. Look at Starbucks.com. Look at how they do their menu. It's a mega menu like this that starts with menu, then drinks, then all the specific drinks, bite, snack, meal. Take advantage of the organizations out there that have spent millions of dollars on the user experience and how they deliver content, and leverage that on your SharePoint. I guarantee that's how your users are thinking as well. They want to get things very, very quickly. It's not a one size fits all, but it's a great way to think about it. The last thing I want to talk about really hits home, and I know especially for VisualSP as well, is we've got to rethink how we're doing training. And I'm going to keep talking about this one until everybody gets it, but people are starting to slowly get it. I love what the team at VisualSP is doing, and those guys. I mean, some of the things they've got coming out are amazing. Hopefully, you guys, some of you will be at Ignite. Hopefully, next week, see some pretty amazing things as well. But you know, up to this point, maybe you've noticed that nothing I've talked about has been about training. Have you noticed that? I've been talking about people and roadblocks and those kind of things. But when we hear adoption, we almost always think we got to train people. That's how we get people to adopt it. We got to train it. And I'll tell you a secret here in a minute. But training is really, it's important, but it's not the most important thing. And so how many of you still like sitting in long all-day training courses and long training classes, right? This hour is probably killing you just being on this hour because you've probably already checked your email 5 times or your text messages. I mean, we all multitask, right? And most of us probably look something like this, right? I mean, we're running from meeting to meeting. We've got 1,000 things going on, and we're just bombarded with information. This is what your typical user looks like. So how do you expect that user to sit through, 1 or 2 day training course and actually retain anything? Even if you give them tip sheets, handouts, worksheets, whatever it may be, we're inundated with information. And in fact, Microsoft did a study last year that actually found out that all the use of technology and how much we multitask and switch gears and all those kind of things, it's actually lowered our attention span more than 25% over the last 10 years. So we now have an attention span of about 8 seconds. So we're not being able to focus on things as long, right? So we've got to understand that when people are using these tools, we need to give them quick ways to get access to this information. And so I want to show you guys a couple stats and see where you are with this. So the first one I'll show you is really around the education method. So this was a study that the Michael Sampson company did, and really it talked about the #1 education method for SharePoint and intranets, right? And many of you probably use this method. Pages on the intranet is kind of how it was categorized, but some sort of knowledge base, some sort of list of pages or wiki pages or whatever it is on the site. And when you have problems, you go to it. Maybe it's even a link to Microsoft Office, on the web or some other help sites or something like that. But having some pages that people have to click through and go to and find out what they need to get to. That was the number one education method. 65% of organizations said this is what they used. Now, they went and then they asked the users, well, here's all the different ways that we've shown you. What's the most effective way? Specific to the education method and this pages on the intranet, only 16% of employees actually said that pages on the intranet was very helpful or extremely helpful. So you see the disconnect here, right? We're doing these things, we're putting all these links up there, and we're throwing 300 links out there and expecting our users to go browse through those when they've got 1,000 other things to do. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to sit through long classroom training. There's a time and a place for some of that, but for the most part, we're busy, we're doing more with less, and we've got to figure out how to give users information really quickly. So we've got to adapt our education methods and how we're training users to be able to adopt these technologies. So I came up with this, what I call prepare and proclaim, and you'll see that coming on your screen now. And I'll talk about both sides of this for a second. So on the prepare side, I mean, you guys can read this, but not everyone's going to be an early adopter. you're going to have some people that want to adopt it, that are part of your pilot group, that want to be at the forefront of this, and I would grab those, and if you look on the Proclaim side, I would make those your ambassadors and your champions, the people that are early adopters and want to grab onto it. The big piece I want to talk about is this middle one and the second and third bullets on the prepare side. We've got to change how we deliver content and training to this more just-in-time, bite-sized, contextual help. And that's really what VisualSP has really done a great job of. If you haven't seen their product, I'll show you a slide next of just one little bit, and you'll see some new stuff next week if you're going to be at Ignite. But we use these things all the time, and it doesn't have to be VisualSP, but just start thinking, how do we deliver content in small chunks? Because when I'm on the intranet, or I'm on SharePoint, or your users are on SharePoint, and I'm in a document library, or I'm trying to figure out how to restore a version, the last thing I want is to figure out, how to set permissions and filtering and creating views and all these things. I don't want to have to weed through all that. All I need to know is how to restore a version. I should be able to find that within a couple seconds. Show me how to quickly get there, right? Whether it's through search, something like that. How do I get there? Because I need to move on. And if I don't, then I'm going to get frustrated. I'm not going to use it, and I'm going to find some other way and some other system to use, right? So how do we deliver information so that we can, tune it to this 8-second attention span? It's sad, but it's true, and that's the new norm. And so we've got to make sure we're understanding those things. And I spend a lot of time understanding kind of how users are changing over the years and kind of the future of work type stuff. The last one there is we've got to start early and repeat regularly. And this is something we see, and to be honest, we actually did this a lot in the past. And most organizations do this. They get this big deployment. Let's just say you've got this big SharePoint intranet deployment, or however you're rolling out SharePoint. And maybe right before the big deployment, they get groups together and then they train everybody, right? You go through this training, maybe you sit in a class, maybe you watch videos, whatever it is, but we train people, right? We have this training event. But then what happens when you hire 10 people next week, or 100 people next year, or 1,000 people over the next 5 years? How do those people get trained? What's your process? Are you just going to send them to these 300 links on the web and say, hey, go view these videos? What's the process? How do you onboard new people? Maybe people coming from different roles into that same role. So starting early helps your users. We actually start training and getting people used to the product and preparing them in parallel with actually building the actual implementation, right? So that by the time we actually get to the deployment, they're really comfortable. We know who our ambassadors and our champions are, and we know what is going to work really well. And then we put a framework in place using the steering committee of monthly webinars, lunch and learns, whatever you want to call them, of how do we regularly find ways to send out something. Maybe it's a little newsletter that says, hey, have you seen these tips? It takes some work, but if you want this sticky adoption, you've got to find a way to stay in front of your users and help them understand new ways of using the tools. You got to help them. Even if it's pulling a blog feed from something else, roll that in and send that out as part of your newsletter. Do something to stay in front of them and give them regular updates and give them a way to kind of find that. And then on the Proclaim side, you got to start spreading the news and building excitement. I mean, one of the things we do is we create campaigns a lot of time around why this is important. What is it going to mean? I mean, maybe it's a poster in the break room. We've done things like a mouse pad that has this branded piece on it. We've done little postcards that end up on everybody's desk when they come in the morning. All kinds of things we've done to get people excited about this new thing, the launch of our new intranet or our new SharePoint site or whatever it's called. I mean, we've seen everything done. We talked about ambassadors and champions, and then the last thing I've already mentioned is helping users understand why, helping them cross that bridge and understand, hey, all this change, it's happening. This is why it's happening. It's not just here's how to do it, but it's important for you to understand why this is different for you. So this is kind of what the VisualSP piece looks like, and it might be a little jumpy, but you can kind of see how it goes around and adds this contextual help, right? So if I'm in these help pages, I can see these little things in there that actually give me really quick context. And I know it's going fast, but you can see these little icons that actually show me, hey, how do I do that? It pops a video inline. How do I edit this page? How do I upload a new document via drag and drop? Whatever the case may be, I can click on these new things and it pops a video or a document. You can put your own help in here. It doesn't mean it all has to be VisualSPs. You can put your own help that you've developed right in line, and so it makes it really easy and really nice to be able to go through that. And then the last thing, again, I want to share, and I'll show you where you can get this, is giving people a way to provide feedback. I mean, once you roll this out, making sure you understand, is this really working? Do people know what they need to do? Are they getting stumped somewhere? And is it a consistent theme that we're seeing a lot of people getting stumped? So this feedback solution. And so without a doubt, it's absolutely true. Training will always be important, and it does affect adoption. But in over 15 plus years of experience with these type tools, training is an area we've seen a ton of changes, right? And the one key I'm going to tell you, and I know that sounds kind of warm and fuzzy, but the key, even more important than training, is to help users understand why they're going through this. You could train them till you're blue in the face. You could train them all day long. And there's been study after study that's now showing this. People won't care how to do something if they don't know why they're doing it. People don't want to be robots. We don't want to come in and just push buttons, right? We don't want to come in and do it the same way, the same way, the same way. How do I make sure that they understand why they're pushing this button, why they're doing it differently, not just how to actually do it? So if we're to kind of do a recap, and I know some questions come in, I'll answer those in a minute. These are really the 5 steps. I mean, these 5 steps, if you could use these again as a checklist, I know there's a lot within these. You guys will have this and be able to go watch this later if you want to. Feel free to reach out to me. I'll show you my contact information at the end. But make sure you have a formal plan. You put people at the center of what you're doing. You try to build a bridge between all these things. You get rid of all these roadblocks that just don't need to be there. Make it easy, and then think differently about how you're going to train and empower your users. And all this, one of my favorite quotes, we have it all over the office. It's on the back of my Surface. We've got to think differently. I mean, if we want to do things differently, and adoption is not working, and it hasn't been working for years, then how do we change that? We can't keep thinking about it the same old way. We can't keep trying the same old things. I think that's the definition of insanity, right? We've got to think differently about how we do it. So for those that have stuck around, 2 quick things. If you guys want to download these tools, I've got the SharePoint feedback, free to download. You want to install it at the site collection level, you can install that, download it, try it out. We're going to do a paid version and a new updated 365 version. Go to our website if you're free to download those. And then the self-evaluation. We've got a ton of other resources, white papers, all kinds of things on better intranets and adoption and all kinds of things there. So hit our website. And if you want to reach out, here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. We'll answer every single email I get. Would love to hear from you. Hey, here's what I'm struggling with. What would you do? Be happy to provide any insight that I could, no pun intended, for you, and I'll help you all I can. And I really appreciate your time. We've got 10, 15 minutes left that I can answer some questions. So while this is up on the screen, let me go see what kind of questions we had, and I'll see if you want to jump in too, feel free as well. Yep. Pop this out. So I think you guys can see these questions. Maybe not. So I think you saw that one. You answered it. Do you have a sample adoption plan? I do. Valerie, if you're still on, I have a sample adoption plan. I've actually got a workshop in week after Ignite. We're actually doing a workshop where we actually go through how to build an intranet or a SharePoint adoption plan. But yeah, reach out to me, Valerie Black, if you're still on. I'll be happy to shoot you over some samples and kind of what should go in an adoption plan and how you might approach that. Be happy to. You can see my email there, curtis@c5insight.com. Michelle, as a trainer, I'm really glad to see someone focusing on how important the right type of training is. Yep, absolutely. So those were easy. I thought we'd get some curveballs in here. Those were easy questions. So I appreciate all of it. If you got any more, again, I'm going to be on here. If not, we can give you some of your day back. Happy to stay on though if you've got any more questions or want to ask anything of me. There's some more coming in. Good. Thank you, Shelley. You talk about flexibility, but yet consistency. How do you find the balance? It's a great question. Gosh, probably a lot bigger than on here. I can, why don't I do this, Shelley? If you'll shoot me an email so I'll have your email address, I'll write you back and be able to give you more context on that. But it really is a balancing act. What you've got to find out, again, it's that rigid at the core, flexible at the edges. Consistency is really around the core things, making sure people know where it is, but giving them areas to play. So I'll give you a good example, and this might not be a great example, but if calendars are always on the right side, middle way down, maybe they can change how it looks and all these kind of things, but maybe it's in the same location. So that's just kind of a simple example, but there's a lot of ways to just try to find, what flexibility do they really need? What do we need to be able to have for them to do their job, but also how do we make sure it's consistent? Branding is one of the biggest things for consistency. We see a lot of branding inconsistencies, which is crazy, and that just drives people insane when they have to figure out where things are and it looks different ways and different colors and things like that. Karen, shoot me an email. I'll shoot you a sample adoption plan. Yep, thank you. Um, Michelle, what do you see end users struggling the most with in SharePoint? It depends on who you ask. I mean, there's so many different things. I think the biggest thing that we see is just being able to find information. We're seeing, that's why I add that rot one in there. We're seeing a ton around findability. No matter when we go in and we do assessments, always within the top 3 or 4 is findability, searchability. We've got a bunch of stuff. I know it's great stuff. I just can't find it. Or maybe it's in multiple places, and that's where some integration and search is amazing in SharePoint. You can actually hook it into a lot of different data sources, right? And have it search your file shares and websites and things like that. So I think search and findability is probably one of the top things, but also just being able to easily navigate the sites and being able to know where to go get things, it being crowded and just too much content. Is a big issue as well, and then permissions always comes up as far as not being able to have the right access and those kind of blocking points and roadblocks as well. What are the more important governance points? So Bill, that's a big one. I've got a whole governance session that I do. Bill, shoot me an email if you will, just so I'll make sure I have your question, because once I leave the webinar I won't have the context of all these. Bill, if you could send me an email with this exact same question, I'll reach out to you and be happy to share some things. I can even show you what goes in a governance plan. Slide deck, is it available for download? Yep, it will be. How do you explain the why? A lot of questions coming in. That's great. How do you explain the why if users are not at all technologically savvy? That's a great question. And the key to the why, the short answer is, and it's a big question as well, the short answer to the why is to forget about technology, because that's really the how, right? That's the how do you do it, where do I click? Really what you're trying to do is tie it back to what matters to that person. If I'm in accounting and I'm working on expenses or purchasing, or I'm in AP or AR, how do I tie back the new intranet to this is going to be better for that person's role? And if you can't, you got to be honest with yourself and say, hey, have we just forgotten about this role? Have we forgotten about this group? Or is there something in there I'm not thinking about? So you've really got to tie it back. Forget technology at all. You've got to tie it back to here's why this is happening. We can teach you the how, but if you want to know why, this is why we're making you do this, because now you'll be able to go back and search the history of all the things we paid and start to see trends that we're spending a lot of money here, whatever the case may be. That's just one example. But why should be technology agnostic. It should not have to do with the technology. That's more of the how and kind of the training piece of it. Ken, shoot me an email. I can definitely show you some sample governance plans, charters, steering committee things. We've got all kinds of things like that. Karen, we're halfway through our delivery program, Wrestling with Adoption. Have leaders who want it to work but don't role model themselves. How do you tackle this? Sometimes you need a stick, I mean, there's no great way to tackle that. One of the things we do before we even get started is we make sure, and again, going through the charter and everything like that, you make sure that you've got that leadership buy-in. And I always say this: leadership buy-in and commitment is not signing it, by the CFO or the CEO or whoever signed it to say, yes, I approve that budget to do it. That's not buy-in and commitment. That's approval, right? Buy-in and commitment is, I believe in this and I want it to work and I'm going to use it too. And so the best way I think to do that is to understand these specific leaders. So they want it to work, but don't role model it. Figure out if there's specific ones, maybe it's a handful, figure out what matters to them. If it's a CFO or if somebody that's really cares about financial and the investment of this, and are we going to get our money back, and is it really helping people be productive, and the financial piece of it, tie it back to financial and say, hey, guess what? If people don't use this, it's because you guys aren't modeling it. And if they don't, we're putting all this money into it, and the investment is, and the return on investment is zero. And so really understanding, I think that's the key to making anybody do something they may not, want to do, is tie it back to, again, the why. Why should I have to role model this? Well, one, because you're a leader in the organization. That's probably not always enough. let me tie it back to something that matters to them. Guess what? If your people don't use it, then you're going to have these things all over the place. And we're going to have to hire 3 more accountants to kind of manage this process because you're not following the process that we built on SharePoint. Oh, well, I don't want to hire 3 more people. So hopefully that makes sense, Karen. You got to tie it back to what matters to them. If management is not convinced with SharePoint, how to convince them to use SharePoint? Similar thing, Sunil. If the management team is not convinced, you got to tie it back to what's in it. And part of that, I hate to say it this way, but part of that should have been discovered up front. You know, are they likely to do it? Maybe they said all the right things, but now when the rubber hits the road, they're not really wanting to do it. But really, I mean, helping them understand here's what's in it for you as well. And if you don't do it and you don't lead by example, this is what's going to happen downstream. And painting out that negative picture for them. Sometimes it helps to paint a bleak picture to get people to do action. You've got to really find out. I mean, it goes back, finding out what matters to those people. Does the SharePoint feedback tool work in SharePoint Online? It does, Ignacio. It does work in SharePoint Online. They've changed the framework online, so we're working really hard to get a new model out there. Hopefully, it should still install, but they've given us a time frame that basically saying, hey, this year, by the end of the year, it's probably not going to work anymore. So we're working hard, but it should work today. But we're gonna anybody that requests it, we're gonna go back and give them the new version as well. Couple more minutes. Sean, how do you most successfully approach ROT? Wow, that's huge. Yep, automated process or site owner engagement. It's a combination. It's never one or the other. So we've actually built out, and our team has built out PowerShell scripts on the technical side to actually go through and mine and find groupings of data. Maybe it's based on title and file size, and to try to find duplicate data. There's probably other tools out there. And then it spits that out into an Excel. So that's kind of one piece of kind of the first pass. So I would think of it like iterations. You've got kind of pass 1, which is let us just try to find everything. And then we find out where that is. So it's for this department, that department. And then we send those out to the departments and to the individual site owners, and we have to get them involved. Unfortunately, it's not 100% hands-off because somebody has to decide, is this the right document or is this the right document? Or do you need both of them and this one needs to change its title because it's actually a little bit different. It shouldn't have been named the same thing. So it's a combination. Great question though. We've got a lot of different things on how you approach ROT, but really you have to figure out, I think, first and foremost, Sean, of what is redundant. I mean, that's pretty easy. You know, what is duplicated? What is outdated? That's a little bit harder. What does outdated mean to your organization? Some it might mean 5 years, 7 years. Some it might mean a year it's outdated, or 10 years. So figuring out that. The hardest one of all is this trivial. And that's why I say take a tiered approach, get the redundant first, then try to find the outdated and older things, and that can be automated. And then the last thing is the trivial. How do you define trivial? And trivial is probably different between people, departments, all kinds of things. So sometimes that takes a long time. That's kind of the last one you approach because it's so out there, and there's probably less trivial. I mean, there's some of that, but we find a lot of the content is probably concentrated in the redundant and the outdated content. That's where a lot of it really is, that they didn't have policies in place to archive information over a certain period of time. Couple more. Ken, on searchability, have you seen the implementation of Delve as helping circumvent the issue of ROT? It does help some. I mean, Delve right now, I've got mixed reviews on that. I think Microsoft's doing some great things on this idea of the smart intranet, right? Surfacing things that are relevant, and it's actually getting a lot better. So I think that is going to help. But again, it will get rid of some of it, but I've seen Delve bring up ROT before, right? I mean, especially outdated, it's probably not going to do as much because it knows how to choose things that are really, really relevant. But it might be something that's really relevant and 2 people have changed something that's very similar and you get multiple copies. And I've actually seen that in our own organization of, hey, this looks similar. Do we need to merge those 2 together or whatever it is? So it definitely helps you kind of sift through it. I wish you could tune Delve a little bit better. But right now, I think maybe some of that will come, and this idea of the smart intranet. But to me, you just got to clean up the back end. You've just got to clean up your content. You got to have a good handle on it, and it might take a few years. That's a project that you can start kind of in parallel. Start with passes. Let's do this department in the next 2 or 3 months or next quarter. Let's do this department. Let's just slowly try to get our content out. This can be one of those ones where kind of small steps add up to big wins. Just start small as you kind of go through it. Great questions. Love those questions. Those are awesome. Hopefully I've answered all of those. If I haven't, shoot me an email with any other questions you have. Be happy to answer all those as well. Hey, Bill, thanks for that. The 2 p.m. one that I had is actually canceled. If you registered for that, I don't know if you had already registered. We actually canceled that webinar. It's different than this, totally different. That one actually focuses completely on the internet. There's just a small adoption piece in it. This one's specifically on adoption. If you shoot me an email, Bill, I will send you a video recording of that. And this is also one that is on VisualSP as well, the building a better internet. But it's totally different than this adoption one. You'll hear some common themes, which is good, but it's totally based on how do I get people to use my internet, and how do I build a better internet that is usable and that people like and want to use. So it is different.